At 9:23 this morning, deep inside a secure warehouse facility in St. Hyacinthe, Quebec, roughly 47 miles east of Montreal, something happened that has never occurred in the 158-year history of North American agricultural trade agreements. The Quebec Maple Syrup Producers Federation, which controls 72% of the world's maple syrup supply through what economists call the Global Strategic Maple Reserve, made a decision that will send shockwaves through Vermont's entire food production economy. I need you to understand the weight of what I am about to tell you, because what happened in that warehouse this morning isn't just a trade story or some obscure agricultural dispute. This is a calculated economic weapon being deployed against American producers, and the next 96 hours will determine whether Vermont's $4 billion food industry survives or collapses under pressure from a cartel operating just across our northern border. If you care about American economic sovereignty and the survival of family farms that have operated for generations, you need to subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because the timeline I'm about to show you reveals a pattern of economic warfare that has been building for 18 months, and what happens in the next 4 days will determine whether we still have a domestic maple industry by spring harvest season. Here's what we know, and I want to be very clear about the sourcing because this information comes from people who were briefed within hours of the decision. 3 independent sources, 2 from Vermont Agricultural Trade Associations, 1 from a consultant who works directly with producers in Franklin County, have confirmed to us exactly what transpired in that emergency meeting of the Federation's Executive Board. According to official minutes that were transmitted to industry insiders less than 6 hours ago, the Federation voted unanimously to restrict export allocations to American bottlers and food manufacturers by 34% effective March 15th, which is exactly 9 days from today. The restriction applies specifically to bulk syrup sales, the industrial-grade product that Vermont's value-added food sector depends on for everything from specialty candies to bourbon barrel-aged syrup to the craft food products that generate $1.2 billion in annual revenue for the state's economy. Flight tracking data, which is publicly available through agricultural trade monitoring systems, shows that 2 executives from Vermont's Specialty Foods Alliance departed Burlington International Airport at 11:47 last night on a private charter headed to Washington, D.C., and sources familiar with the emergency consultations say they met with USDA trade officials at 7:30 this morning to discuss retaliatory options. Based on 20 years of covering agricultural trade conflicts, my assessment is that we are witnessing the weaponization of a commodity that most Americans think of as a breakfast condiment, but that represents the economic lifeblood of an entire regional industry employing 17,000 people across Vermont, New Hampshire, and upstate New York. Now let me walk you through exactly how we got here, because the timeline matters enormously and every single step was documented. This did not happen overnight. This was a cascade of economic decisions, regulatory changes, and strategic miscalculations that began in October 2024 when the Quebec Federation first announced what they called sustainability reforms to the Global Strategic Maple Reserve. On October 12, 2024, the Federation published new production quota guidelines that reduced authorized tapping allocations for Quebec producers by 6%, a seemingly minor adjustment that industry analysts initially dismissed as routine resource management. But here's what most people do not know about that October decision. According to 2 economists who reviewed the internal Federation projections, that 6% reduction was never about sustainability. It was about manufacturing scarcity to drive up global prices at exactly the moment when American producers were expanding their own operations to meet growing demand from the craft food sector. By November 18th, the situation escalated. Vermont producers, sensing an opportunity created by reduced Quebec output, increased their tapping operations by 11% across the state's 2,400 registered sugar houses. Production data from the Vermont Maple Sugar Makers Association shows that November 2024 harvest projections hit record levels, with total anticipated output reaching 2.5 million gallons, a 15% increase over the previous year's yield. That expansion represented millions of dollars in equipment investment, new pipeline installations, upgraded evaporators, and hiring commitments from producers who believed they were responding to legitimate market demand. What they didn't know, what nobody outside the Federation's inner circle knew, was that Quebec was watching every barrel of increased American production and preparing a response that would trap Vermont producers in an economic vice. Then came December 3rd, the day everything changed but nobody noticed yet. The Federation announced what they called a technical recalibration of export classifications, a bureaucratic adjustment so boring that it barely registered in trade publications. But according to a trade consultant who reviewed the regulatory language, that recalibration reclassified bulk industrial syrup under a different tariff code that gave the Federation unilateral authority to restrict export volumes without requiring approval from Canadian federal trade authorities. In other words, they gave themselves the legal mechanism to do exactly what they did this morning, and they did it so quietly that American producers had no idea the trap was being set. By the time Vermont's agricultural trade lawyers identified the classification change in mid-January, the regulatory comment period had already closed and the new framework was locked in. Before we get to what happened next, I need to tell you about the man whose silence has been the loudest confession of economic aggression. Simon Trepanier serves as Executive Director of the Quebec Maple Syrup Producers Federation, a position he has held since 2019. This is not some small-town agricultural cooperative manager. Trepanier holds an MBA from McGill University, spent 12 years in commodity trading for agricultural futures markets, and has publicly stated in Canadian trade journals that his strategic priority is maintaining Quebec's absolute dominance over global maple syrup pricing mechanisms regardless of American production capacity. In a 2023 interview with Le Devoir, a Montreal newspaper, Trepanier said, and I'm translating from French here, that Vermont producers represent, quote, romantic amateurs playing in a market that requires industrial discipline and coordinated supply management. That's not competitive analysis. That's contempt for American producers, and it reveals the mindset driving today's export restrictions. Now here's where it gets dangerous. On January 27th, just 39 days ago, Vermont Specialty Foods Alliance announced a $47 million expansion of value-added maple production facilities in Montpelier and Rutland, with construction scheduled to begin in April and production launch targeted for September 2026. That expansion was predicated on securing bulk syrup supply contracts that Alliance members had negotiated with Quebec producers throughout late 2024. Those contracts, reviewed by industry attorneys, contained force majeure clauses allowing the Federation to suspend deliveries in cases of natural disasters, crop failures, or what the contracts vaguely termed extraordinary market conditions. Nobody thought those clauses would ever be invoked during a year of record Quebec production. But this morning, according to sources who received notification calls from Federation representatives, every single one of those bulk supply contracts was suspended under the extraordinary market conditions provision, leaving Vermont manufacturers with 9 days to secure alternative supply sources that simply do not exist at the volumes they require. This is where the story takes a turn nobody saw coming. At 6:47 this morning, before the Federation's official announcement went public, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange Maple Futures Market registered trading volume that was 340% above normal levels, with prices spiking 23% in the first 18 minutes of trading. According to two commodities analysts who track agricultural futures, that price movement indicates that sophisticated traders had advanced knowledge of the export restrictions and were positioning themselves to profit from the manufactured shortage. The Securities and Exchange Commission has protocols for investigating suspicious trading patterns in agricultural commodities, but sources familiar with enforcement priorities say that maple syrup futures represent such a small market that they rarely trigger regulatory scrutiny unless someone files a formal complaint alleging market manipulation. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button right now, because what I'm about to show you next is why this operation is fundamentally different from routine trade disputes, and the implications reach far beyond Vermont's specialty food sector. Subscribe now if you want to follow where this economic warfare leads, because I will be tracking every development, and the mainstream agricultural press will be 3 days behind everything I'm showing you. The Quebec Federation controls what industry insiders call the Global Strategic Maple Reserve, a network of temperature-controlled warehouses holding approximately 133 million pounds of maple syrup in barrel storage. This reserve was established in 2000 as a price stabilization mechanism, allowing the Federation to withhold supply during high production years and release reserves during crop failures to prevent wild price fluctuations. But according to former Canadian agricultural trade officials who helped design the reserve system, the mechanism was never intended as an export restriction weapon targeting specific countries. The reserve was supposed to smooth price volatility globally, not create artificial shortages to punish American competitors. What we're seeing today represents a fundamental perversion of that system's original purpose, transforming a stabilization tool into an economic cudgel. And it gets worse. According to documents obtained by Vermont agricultural attorneys, the Federation's export restriction applies specifically and exclusively to American purchasers. European buyers, Japanese importers, and even Chinese manufacturers can still purchase bulk Quebec syrup under existing contract terms with no allocation reductions. The 34% cut targets only United States commercial buyers, which under World Trade Organization rules could constitute discriminatory trade practices subject to formal dispute resolution. But here's the problem with WTO enforcement. The complaint process takes 18 to 24 months, and by the time any ruling comes down, Vermont's spring 2026 production season will be over and manufacturers will have already absorbed catastrophic losses or gone out of business entirely. Let me show you what this actually means on the ground in Vermont, because the numbers are staggering. Vermont's 2,400 sugar houses produced 2.5 million gallons last year, but that represents only 6% of total North American consumption. The other 94% comes from Quebec, and Vermont's value-added sector depends on purchasing Quebec bulk syrup to supplement local production for their manufacturing operations. A single craft maple candy manufacturer in Montpelier uses 47,000 gallons of syrup annually, of which only 8,000 gallons comes from Vermont sources. That company employs 83 people with an annual payroll of $3.2 million. If they cannot secure the additional 39,000 gallons they need from Quebec suppliers, they will have to reduce production by 71%, which means layoffs starting in April when their spring inventory runs out. Multiply that scenario across Vermont's entire specialty food sector, and you're looking at potential job losses exceeding 4,700 positions, most of them in rural communities where alternative employment barely exists. But wait, there's something even worse I haven't told you yet. According to 3 sources familiar with internal Federation discussions, this export restriction is just phase 1 of a longer-term strategy. The Federation is reportedly planning to announce new sustainability regulations in June that would further restrict bulk exports, while simultaneously increasing Quebec's own value-added production capacity, directly competing with Vermont manufacturers in the exact premium product categories where American producers currently hold market advantages. In other words, they are not just restricting supply. They are positioning themselves to steal market share while American competitors are starved of raw materials and unable to fulfill their own customer orders. Here's what concerns me most, and I want you to pay very close attention to this timeline, because what happens in the next 96 hours will determine everything. The export restrictions take effect March 15th. Vermont producers have scheduled their annual spring harvest coordination meeting for March 12th, which is now 3 days before they lose access to supplemental Quebec supply. That meeting will determine whether Vermont attempts a coordinated emergency response, whether producers try to increase their own output to compensate for lost Quebec access, or whether the industry fragments into individual survival mode with every producer protecting their own interests. According to someone who has attended these coordination meetings for the past decade, there is deep division among Vermont producers about how to respond, with older traditional sugar house operations blaming the specialty food manufacturers for antagonizing Quebec through aggressive market expansion, while the value-added sector argues that Quebec was always going to weaponize the reserve system regardless of American behavior. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on because this story is far from finished, and when the March 12th meeting happens, when we see whether Vermont mounts a unified response or fractures under pressure, you will see detailed analysis here immediately. Every like tells the algorithm this story matters and helps push this content to more people who deserve to know what's really happening to American agricultural independence. Now let me show you the 3 scenarios that are now on the table, because we are running out of time and the situation is accelerating faster than most people realize. Let me bring this together. What we are witnessing is the weaponization of a commodity that most Americans consider a harmless breakfast product, but that represents economic survival for thousands of families across Vermont and the broader Northeast. Quebec controls the supply. They've built the infrastructure to restrict it, and they've chosen this moment to deploy that weapon against American producers who dared to expand their operations and compete in premium product markets. Scenario 1, and I give this a 45% probability, Vermont fractures and Quebec wins. The March 12th coordination meeting produces no unified response. Individual producers panic and start competing with each other for limited Quebec supply, driving up prices and destroying any leverage for collective negotiation. Specialty food manufacturers, unable to secure raw materials, begin shutting down production lines by May. By the 2026 fall harvest season, 30% of Vermont's value-added maple sector has collapsed, with manufacturers either bankrupted or acquired by Quebec-backed investment groups at distressed prices. Quebec consolidates control over both production and manufacturing, and American maple products become essentially rebranded Canadian goods. If this happens, it sets a precedent for agricultural trade warfare that will embolden other commodity cartels to weaponize supply restrictions against American producers across multiple sectors. Scenario 2, probability 30%, federal intervention through emergency USDA action. Vermont's congressional delegation, led by Senator Peter Welsh, secures emergency agricultural support funding, and USDA invokes national security provisions under agricultural trade law to impose retaliatory tariffs on all Canadian maple imports. The tariffs are set at 50%, making Quebec syrup economically unviable for American buyers and forcing a return to negotiated trade terms. But this scenario requires political will that may not exist, and it triggers a broader trade war with Canada that affects dairy, lumber, and other cross-border agricultural sectors. The economic disruption spreads beyond maple into a generalized northern border trade crisis. Scenario 3, probability 25%, Vermont emergency expansion. Producers launch a coordinated crash program to increase domestic production capacity by 40% before the 2026 spring season, funded through a combination of state agricultural loans, private investment from specialty food manufacturers, and cooperative bulk purchasing agreements that bypass Quebec entirely. This requires installing 340 miles of new pipeline systems, purchasing 180 new evaporators, and recruiting 600 additional seasonal workers, all within 10 months. It's logistically brutal, financially risky, and dependent on favorable weather conditions during tapping season. But if it succeeds, Vermont achieves genuine supply independence and permanently reduces reliance on Quebec sources. The probability is low because the capital requirements are massive and the timeline is nearly impossible, but sources say preliminary discussions about this option are already happening among the largest producer cooperatives. But here's why this matters beyond Vermont's maple industry and beyond agricultural trade disputes. This is a test case for whether regional commodity cartels can successfully weaponize basic food supplies against American producers without facing meaningful consequences. If Quebec succeeds in crushing Vermont's specialty food sector through coordinated supply restrictions, you will see this playbook deployed across other agricultural commodities where foreign producers hold dominant market positions. Canadian dairy, Mexican avocados, Brazilian coffee. Any commodity where American producers represent a competitive threat to established foreign cartels becomes a potential weapon in economic warfare that operates below the threshold of formal trade sanctions, but above the level of market competition. So what can you actually do about this? Because I know many of you are watching this feeling powerless. Public pressure works. Contact your congressional representatives and demand emergency USDA intervention to protect Vermont producers from discriminatory trade practices. The contact information is available through your representative's website, and calls from constituents on agricultural trade issues do get tracked and do influence policy decisions. Share this video with anyone who cares about American agricultural independence, because the mainstream press is not covering this story with the urgency it deserves, and most Americans have no idea that a foreign cartel is actively working to destroy thousands of American jobs. And most importantly, stay informed by subscribing to this channel right now, because in the next 96 hours, everything could change based on how Vermont responds and whether federal authorities recognize this as the economic warfare it actually is. The next 4 days will determine whether American agricultural producers can still compete in their own domestic markets, or whether we've reached the point where foreign commodity cartels can simply strangle American competition whenever it becomes inconvenient to their profit margins. Subscribe to this channel right now, because when that March 12th meeting happens, when we see the first production shutdowns, when any federal response emerges, I will bring you the analysis before the spin machine buries the truth. This is history unfolding in real time. The stakes have never been higher for Vermont's food economy, and the outcome will establish precedents that affect American agricultural sovereignty for the next generation. Drop a comment below. Do you think Vermont producers can mount a unified response? Or will Quebec's supply weapon fracture the industry beyond repair? I want to hear from you, and I read every single comment.